everyone, and welcome to the very first PMA Podcast. I am your host, Landon Blackhall, and it is a pleasure to have your company from wherever you're listening, Australia, New Zealand, and around the world. I'm joined by two of the industry's greatest minds, and first off, may I present to you the Managing Editor of PokerMedia Australia, Mr. Ben Blaschke. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Landon. It's awesome to be doing this podcast. We've been talking about it for quite a while, actually, and what better time than now when we're all, I guess, stuck at home for a few months, and plenty to chat about as always, though.
And one man in particular who also doesn't mind a chat is the 2002 Clio Bachelor of the Year, former TV voiceover artist and poker commentator extraordinaire, Paul the Voice Khoury. An honour and a privilege to have you with us, sir.
Yes, and I was worried when you said greatest minds until you just got to that intro there, Landon. Thank you very much for embarrassing me. It's good to see you both. Looking forward to having a chat about the State of the Union in terms of poker and other things.
Absolutely, our pleasure. But before we chat about the State of the Union, how have you guys been going? I mean, these are extraordinary times that we're living in. Ben, I could only imagine, particularly, given your work as well in the Asia Pacific market, it must be a really challenging time for you.
It is, and apologies if you hear my dog playing in the background and squeaking everything at the moment. She's chosen the perfect time to do that, as I predicted she would. Look, it's been a pretty interesting time. As you know, I do a lot of work in Macau. I was actually in London in early February at a big gaming show called ICE, which some of our viewers and listeners would no doubt have heard of. I was supposed to fly back to Macau. The day before I was supposed to fly back, I'd heard that Virgin had cancelled all international flights. I was a bit worried that Qantas might do the same, so I skipped Macau, came straight back to Sydney. That actually seems like a pretty good choice now that we're seeing what's happening. I know that most countries are in lockdown, mostly through Asia. You can't get in or out. We're the same in Australia now, so here we are. We're not actually in lockdown in terms of being trapped in our homes, but certainly we're at home a lot, and a lot of the places we like to go, including the casinos and the pubs and the clubs where we like to play poker, are all closed. So it's a very different environment out there, and it's unusual, but I guess we just have to make the most of it for now.
Now, Paul, you've taken a step away from the game in the last few years. You've moved on to a different industry. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing now and how COVID-19 has actually affected you?
I kind of took a step towards brands and professional services about 5-6 years ago. Main reason is brands tend to cross different media channels. So I was, moving from one form of expression to another, and that just continued to evolve. But what was a common thread was brands. And then, and I was always kind of solutions focused because I was always exposed to many failures across those brands and formats. So after a while, I guess people wanted to hear what I had to say about failures. People want to know about why formats or ideas or programs fail. So that experience became really relevant. So it kind of formed more in a professional services manner. And now I also lead Asia Pacific, a team in Asia Pacific, which is a wonderful job working with huge brands and a terrific team that we basically built from the ground up. What it has allowed me to do is to move away from poker in terms of primary focus. It was my primary focus for quite some time, and that wasn't the original plan, right? It was mainstream media, doing a bit of this and that and the other, whatever you can get your hands on, and then poker evolved, and it was a love of mine, so it became the focus for almost a decade. Now, ironically, many of the countries that I worked in on poker are within my regional remit, so that's kind of allows me to go back into old stomping grounds under a different hat. And no one really around me knows about that historical context. But what's really relevant is the supply chain disruption and the impact. I think that's common to all verticals at the moment. I think everybody in every industry, you can take a ticket, start with airlines, and then go to hotels and watch the bouncing ball go from hospitality to every other business, retail. Everyone's getting hit. No one's protected. Maybe the online platforms who have got really established networks are thriving at the moment. Probably IT infrastructure will take a surge because they're all now, I would imagine, scrambling out there to to help businesses virtualize.
Absolutely. And just a
yeah.
prime example of that, the very platform that we are recording this broadcast on today, Zoom, is taken, I think it's an 800% jump in profit alone just within the last 3 months. Like it's incredible just the way that the world is changing as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. But Paul, no doubt that obviously with your new ventures there, you're keeping an ear to the ground in the industry. So let's just touch on that. Of course, we were off to a rip-roaring start here in Australia. Like we were on the verge of what I deem to be a second renaissance when it comes to poker, and particularly the live poker scene in Australia. And starting off with the Aussie Millions, Ben, safe to say that, you know, this is now not just the premier event here in the Southern Hemisphere, but one of the premier events in the entire world.
Well, I think it has been for a long time. I think the Aussie Millions has been looked at as an event that still managed to draw some of the biggest names in the world year after year. It's got that prestige from its years as the I think it was the Australian Poker Championships originally, and evolving into the Aussie Millions has got that reputation. So, $10,000 buy-in main event is always going to attract some sort of attention. But again, as you say, we saw basically record numbers through most of the events this year. I think it was the third year in a row with more than 800 in the main event.
And in fact, it was the second highest main event field in history as well. So full credit to Joel Williams, Hayley Breen, and the team there at Crown Melbourne. I mean, particularly in the last couple of years, they've really ramped up the live satellite program there at Crown Melbourne. Paul, undoubtedly, that's been the key factor when it comes to the success of the Aussie Millions in a market where we don't have a regulated online presence.
Well, they kind of had to, didn't they? I mean, it's not. I don't think when Black Friday happened, there was just a safe assumption everybody was just going to run back inside and play live poker. I think people were still scrambling around trying to figure out whether this was going to be permanent, or whether it was, there was a way around it, or and whether that way was legal. But eventually, what Aussie Millions and Joel and the team at Crown did very well is implemented a very aggressive satellite structure. And that first year after Black Friday would have been a very testing one. And they worked very hard to get that structure up in place and get those players in. And it was real grassroots stuff, for Crown. It was almost like starting again, knowing that they had a standard to keep, and they kept it. They worked very hard at the personal stuff. You mentioned Hayley. I know that Hayley always works very hard with the players. Joel, a constant presence on the floor. It's always that familiar feeling. That's hard to maintain in a world with a lot of competition in poker. It really is. I mean, you go to Sydney and you've got a lot more options than the casino. In Melbourne, it's not so, but people still didn't just make that choice. People wanted to go, you still got to go and want to play. I think they did a terrific job, and I think that sort of gave them the formula. Yeah, there was a dip for a little while. We missed some events there that were on the calendar, some events that I was pretty close to. APPT and ANZPT sort of started to question their validity in the market and understand that they may not be sustainable models. What really became evident was that Crown just went, well, we can't have 7, or 6, a series of 6 and a big event. We've got to have one really big one and maybe another calendar event another time of the year.
But I think we are starting to see a lot of the smaller buy-in series, the smaller buy-in tournaments being pushed out into a lot of these mid-tier events that have been established, particularly within the last 3 or 4 years. A couple of relatively new players come to mind, particularly in the form of the Australian Poker Tour, the APT, and also the WPT League, which I believe are 2 of the leading poker markets for that particular level of play right now. And dare I say it, I think both the APT and the WPT League have superseded the APL, who were the original and the best. They were the first pub league of its kind ever in the Southern Hemisphere. They got their foot into the door very, very early after the Great Australian Poker Boom in 2005, and they've been one of the market leaders ever since. In my professional opinion, and I've been involved particularly in that area of the market for a long time, I think the APL has rested on their laurels quite a bit. I think that they haven't really catered to their evolving market. They've really stuck with a beginner player base, which obviously there is room for that market there. But with the exception of the APL Million, I just don't think they have really sort of stepped up against the competition that's emerged within the last 3 or 4 years. But Ben, you were recently at the APL Million, and based on your observations, what do you think? I mean, a lot of people seem to share that view that the APL is not what it used to be. Would you agree?
First of all, I think that this is, you've got some good points there about the APL is doing what they've done for a long time, and they've done that very well, and they still are. As you say, there are a lot more competitors in the market now, and the APL may need to, and maybe using its time right now, to just have a look back at their strategy. They may as well have a look now. They're a little bit different in that the APL Million is clearly their one standout flagship, which is considerably the next step up in terms of buy-ins and players and who their player base is playing against than any other event they hold. And the APL Million as an event itself at the start of their 3 tournament series during the year, is the APL Million to step down from the star level in terms of price point. So you've got that, the APL Million at the Star Poker Room in Sydney brings together that sort of melting pot in some way between your professional players and your pub poker players. Many of whom are very good players, I might say, by the way. But going into the casino and playing this is a different experience. In terms of the APL Million itself, there was some issues around, a bit of confusion around some of the events were run this year. I know there were a lot of reserves in some of the events, which is both good and bad. But the numbers don't lie too. They had 1,404 players in their main event this year,
and this was a $1,500 buy-in event as well. So
exactly,
to compare the events like APT and the WPT League main events, they're getting those sorts of entry numbers for their 175 buy-in price point. That also includes re-entries. But we're talking over 1,400 entries for a $1,500 buy-in tournament.
But are they running an aggressive satellite structure behind that, Lando? Do they give it a good lead up? That's really important. It's one thing to compare one product on the shelf. Not, I'm always looking for value. So to me, I'm impartial. But, if it's giving 6 months run up with lots of satellite opportunities, it really does allow a huge entry. And I like that because it allows people to qualify for a lot cheaper. But is it a true indicator versus another tourney?
It's a very good point you raised there, Paul. And just to make it clear, with events like the APT main event and the WPT League main events, they're obviously not running an aggressive satellite campaign because the buy-in price point is so much smaller. You do have, like, for example, when I was in Tweed Heads, they had a couple of $25 buy-in satellites running occasionally. But of course, given that the price point was so affordable, there wasn't really much of a point in doing so. Whereas, of course, with the APL Million, it's, they have to run that aggressive structure for, what is essentially 10 times the buy-in.
Yeah, it sounds like they've done a very good job of it too with those kind of numbers. Yeah. That's crazy numbers. That's great. It's
and I think this was
nice to hear.
4th year of the APL Million.
Correct.
So,
yeah.
They're now running it as their flagship. People know it's coming. They can prepare many, many months in advance. And as you say, it's you got players coming to the APL Million from all over the place, all over the country, just about, to come and play in that event that have qualified. So, they've done a very good job, and the numbers are building pretty steadily every year.
Interesting point before we move on, though, is that with the APL, they were actually in the process of relaunching, rather, the APL Poker Tour in essentially what would be the APL branded version of these competitors' events. So this was all due to start in May, actually, in Melbourne, just before this all blew up with COVID-19. So it'd be interesting to see what happens with that after this. But again, it's going to be a very different landscape once this all dies down and life sort of gets back to normal.
So just a question, Landon, what is the defining difference? From a person that's loved and always kept an eye on the arena, it's been hard over the last couple of years to identify what really underneath the fundamental changes are. What are they doing differently that allows them to take that spot or rival, an APL? Because they had a real chunk of the market, the APL, and they're still out there.
Absolutely.
And they are very prominent in the Australian poker world, as I know. What's WPT done that's different to you?
I had the privilege of being invited as the media coordinator for the WPT League event in Tweed Heads just before COVID-19 struck. And I have to tell you, gents, when Oliver Gill turns around to you and says that this is the second best poker room in the country, he's not kidding. It is on par with the setup at the Rio. No joke.
Wow, that's a hell of a statement.
Everything is meticulously branded. You've got the proper balustrades. You've got the feature table with the LED, strip set up over the top. It looks like the Thunderdome. Chips, cards, cut cards, dealer buttons. Everything is just meticulously branded. No details left unturned. You can hire power banks for your devices while you're sitting at the tables. You've got WPT League branded bottled water
Lando, that sounds fantastic. In fact, I kind of feel a little bit envious of that was exactly the kind of room I'd love to walk into, when poker first broke. But what are they doing differently?
Well, essentially what Mitch has done through the WPT League is to be able to offer the professional setup at a fraction of the cost. Like, obviously, when we walk into Crown Melbourne, the Aussie Millions, you're going to get that world-class setup, access to live streaming of tables, professional dealers, the whole nine. And also the same can be said with the APT as well. Now, it's interesting because although the WPT League is very much its own brand and it's pretty much just owned and operated by one company, the APT offers very much the same product. Again, that professional world-class setup without the price tag. But it's also, the APT, I find really, really interesting because it's such a unique business model in that it has an affiliation program where you've got all the smaller leagues, particularly the ones based in Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong, but throughout the whole country. They essentially sign on as affiliates with the APT, and they all come together to participate and host these major series. And there was actually going to be 6 scheduled for this year before, obviously, everything hit.
Is that a common model, Landon? Is that something we've seen before in terms of a business model, or is that different?
As far as I'm aware, it's a very, very unique model. Certainly very innovative here in Australia.
Ben, and just a quick question to Ben. Have you been to one of these events and had a look?
APT, no, I haven't yet. It's funny that we're talking about, this whole situation. We're basically on the verge, and I know that Landon was flying from Melbourne to Sydney for the Poker Palace Marconi Cup Carnival, and followed by APT Sydney. So we were both going to be at both of those, but they've been cancelled, unfortunately, due to the coronavirus. And the key point that Landon makes very, very well is the fact that when you talk about the fact that ANZPT and APPT, the model didn't survive, I mean, we're talking about pretty high price points for those events for your average Joe, for your bloke walking around the street. So I think when you've got these events now like WPT League, APLs, more feature events throughout the year, all these sort of regional events we're starting to see pop up, they've got a much more approachable, a much more available price point to average guy. They'll have a 12-event series where all the events are buy-ins between $50 and $150, with maybe one main event a little bit higher. Everybody can play that.
What are the structures like, Ben? Are they? I mean, obviously, not sound. I don't want to sound like a skeptic because I sound like I tend to hold the industry a little bit accountable to the way they've progressed everything into everything's a rebuy or everything's a fast structure to hide valued tournaments. Are they doing that, or are they offering good structures? Because I think that's something that's been a little bit not talked about and missed.
Well, they're a lot better than they used to be. We're not talking about structures that are your Tuesday night at your pub where everybody on the final table has 4 big blinds. We're not at that level. Also, we're not at World Series of Poker with 2-hour levels. Okay, we're sort of somewhere in between usually. So you'll be, depending what event you're playing at, you're looking at levels of 45 minutes to an hour, probably in most cases, which is reasonable for your relatively low buy-in.
That's quite good. That's really quite good, as long as the blinds are treated with sensitivity. Years ago, it was like straight after the tournaments, after the 2005 boom, there was this plethora of value in tournament structures out there. Everybody was offering, here's the tournament and here's the best structure to go with it. And there's the value, there's the buy-in, there's the structure. And people would look at that structure and go, I love that structure. It gives me all the time in the world to get my money in good. And that somehow got lost over years into let's just do it in, 10, 25 grand turbos in 15 minutes. Now, I get that the great players want to move to that kind of action. I get that because the game progressed. But there's still a lot of players out there that look for really good value in tournaments at a low level. And what I see is too many tournament directors look at it and say, we want this over in 3 hours, so we'll work backwards from that point and go, we're going to have the blinds here, or we can do it this way. We'll have very low blinds and then just increase them at third level. There's a lot of tricks you can do to speed up a tournament, and players are smart now. They know that. Where's the best value?
it appears that there seems to be, or there's been a seismic shift into online poker now. And of course, as we know, from an industry standpoint, we do not have a regulated online poker presence here in Australia. The legislation pertaining to online gaming, the Interactive Gaming Act, I believe it was 3 or 4 years ago, was changed, closing all the loopholes and not allowing for offshore operators to actually, to conduct business within our borders. Now, what I'm seeing is essentially a return to the Wild West days of online poker before it all first.
And how are they doing that, Landon? I mean, is it that simple for a person to access offshore? I mean, I'm not allegedly, of course. You've heard.
Allegedly. So from what I've heard, from what I've been speaking to players about, from what I've seen, it appears that not only VPNs are being used to access some of the more major sites, but there are also these smaller app-based agency sites operating under the guise of legality. That is, they're somehow managed to find loopholes within those that have been closed off and to offer play money as well as real money games. Let's just be honest. It's very concerning because, in my view, I think that with all that going on, it's all going to blow up in everyone's faces. But I mean, at the same time, with everything that's going on with the coronavirus, the state and federal governments have plenty more to worry about. So that's
I mean, it's always true. We've kind of been side by side, and I'm sure Ben's got a lot of thoughts on this. But my view is that the grey that was so grey for so long was, you're either, sport's a game. Is it a sport? It's not a sport. It's a game. I agree with Daniel Negreanu. It was really black and white. The world viewed it as grey, but in Australia, legislation-wise, it was never clear, and therefore, when it did become clear, it was kind of, a lot of people started saying sports betting. Why can't it be side by side with sports betting? But right now, that wouldn't change a thing because sports betting sites have just fallen off a cliff as well, because so has sports. So the real question is, I guess, that comes to mind, and I know it's something we're going to talk about anyway, but, the world's going to change. It is changing. Live poker's there and it's there to stay. But right now, you can't go to a pub to play. You can only play online. You can't play online legally. You can't go to a pub to play. In Australia, that basically says to everybody, you can't play poker until COVID-19 restrictions are out.
Exactly right. Well, let me just backtrack 1 second. I just want to make one quick point on the, there's some online gaming going on. And my thoughts on that are, history says that when you ban any sort of gambling, people are going to find a way to do it anyway. That's always been the case with any sort of gambling. That's no different from normal. I'm not surprised. If anything, it's another advertisement for the fact that we need a regulated online gaming industry.
What happens to the big one, the World Series of Poker? Really, that's the question at front of mind, Ben. For me, is when you think, pick one tournament a year that's the jewel, it's still the World Series of Poker. What happens to that? Because clearly that's right around the corner.
Will it happen? Absolutely not. No way in the world. But there's been no announcement yet. What I've been reading, World Series of Poker Caesars have held off so far and probably will hold off until May on making an exact decision. I think the first event of World Series is late May, from memory.
Yeah.
They'd have to be thinking of taking this whole thing online, right, Ben? Which is very ironic, seeing they were the biggest beneficiaries of Black Friday.
Yeah, I look at the World Series of Poker. No, I don't think it will go ahead in any sort of live shape or format. Certainly not on the current dates. It may be postponed.
But this is just another evolution of a business model, right? So put it online. I know I'm simplifying things, but my view is put it online. Get some. Your live webcast just needs to switch what it's seeing. You can still have your commentaries like we're doing what we're doing now. The whole thing can be live on 15-minute delay. The tournament can take place online. It can still be followed by millions around the world. Even if we can't play, you still follow it, and you webcast the thing out to a trillion people. But the question for me is, can you come back from that when you want them to come back indoors? Can you change the business model to online, have a great success, and then what do they do with it next year when the doors are open again?
Well, look, there are issues around moving it to online with liquidity, first of all. I mean, you're going to lose your international, all your international players aren't going to play part of it. So very unlikely they'll be able to get into the States by that stage or anytime soon. So you can
would there be an expectation, Ben, that that's okay, right? So at the moment, I think the world is kind of saying, look, it's okay to have a half measure because of what's going on. Is there an acceptance for that?
Well, I think it's less than a half measure, because the other issue is that there's only a handful of US states where you can play online poker still.
Right.
And so
That's a good
I
answer.
I don't think that's going to affect your professional players who are all based in those states. But I think that your guy that comes up from Florida and from around the country to play is not going to do that. So I question what the numbers would be. I think that'd be a lot smaller. Would it affect people coming back into the live in the future? Absolutely not. I can't see that happening.
Agreed.
Yeah. So I guess the big question is, what do they do? Do they cancel it altogether, or do they just postpone it or try to find new dates? Because this is a very important revenue spinner for Caesars Entertainment, who need that money at the moment.
Vegas is on lockdown, right? So casinos at the moment
Vegas
are hemorrhaging. I'm not, I don't think there's always been a really interesting, strange, ironic relationship between most players and the casinos they go to. It's a bit love-hate in most part, right? And it's been a wonderful part of I had a great career for so long in poker, but you always sort of rolled your eyes and looked around, and you're in a casino, and there is a side not many people speak about being in a casino. And at the moment, there's not a lot of sympathies for casinos losing money. I don't think there would be, but we do want the brands to survive because we all love poker, right? Yeah. So you've got to support them in that way.
Point of order, though, on brand survival, Paul. My major concern out of the WSOP belaying their announcement on what's happening in Las Vegas for so long, considering that we've already had casino-wide shutdowns in Macau. Cambodia has just closed its doors to all its live casinos there, and the Philippines has just closed its casinos and the iGaming industry there. Australia obviously doesn't have any casinos, and the fact that Las Vegas itself is currently in lockdown. As a result of that, so many of these major tours already having made the decision to cancel or postpone their live events indefinitely as a result. Why hasn't the WSOP done the same thing? From a moral and ethical standpoint, that is utterly reprehensible. And I know that the Caesars Entertainment is quite a powerful brand, and the WSOP is so reputable and respected, but this, I believe, is a very, very bad marketing and PR move on their part. Because ultimately, the health and safety of the players is absolutely paramount, and particularly in an environment such as live poker, where there are so many risks when it comes to spreading infection. And that is the primary reason why we're
but they haven't. I'm just jumping in. They haven't said they're going to do it, right? They're just holding off the decision. Is that right?
The feeling is that they will probably have to postpone, but there's been no word whatsoever from Caesars. So
really, let's cut to the core. What is it's ethical because you feel as though they should be leading by example. That's what I'm hearing, right?
Exactly right. And, it draws so many parallels to what's happening on the political landscape as well, worldwide, but we won't go into that.
I think one thing we should make very clear, though, Lando, is that leadership around the world in any vertical, in politics, in business, what we're seeing now, and I'm certainly no expert, is everyone's leadership is being tested. All those decisions are different every day. We're seeing, just today, I saw, Boris Johnson went into ICU, so is he questioning his decision the week before he went into lockdown? I'm not sure. It's a really tough time to judge decisions like that. So I would just leave the door open ajar there. There's some really smart people in those organizations that you need to let bubble to the surface or give them a chance. I'm not letting them off the hook either, Lando. I'm an ethical person too, but give them a chance, because leadership's being really tested around the world. Maybe they're a little bit late. Maybe they've got an idea. Maybe they're going to come up with an idea that we've never seen before, because that's really what we want. We want the whole world needs to be surprised right now, in my view.
I should point out too that this is actually very, very bad timing, this whole situation for Caesars Entertainment, who are about $6 billion in debt, are in the middle of a $17.3 billion merger with Eldorado Resorts. That's on the line. You couldn't have picked a worse time for one of the few remaining assets that Caesars have. Remember, Caesars sold the Rio a few months ago. They sold Harrah's in Las Vegas. They sold Harrah's in Reno, all part of their merger with Eldorado. One of their few remaining high-quality assets is the World Series of Poker brand. You can imagine, right when this merger isn't guaranteed, by the way, it's been given shareholder approval, but it hasn't happened yet. So right in the middle of this, one of their main money spinners throughout the year, the World Series of Poker, is suddenly canned for the year. I mean, there was a bit of talk that maybe this merger might be put in jeopardy by this whole coronavirus situation. Well, losing your biggest brand won't help that either.
Well, I wonder whether, all what we're bumping into is the term force majeure all over the world, right?
Absolutely.
Basically, and what's also being tested is people's resolve to enforce or not enforce. And in business, people are bringing it up and they're sort of talking about it, but they haven't really, I haven't heard that many stories of companies enforcing that part of the commercial agreement. What they tend to do is get to a table and go, look, we understand this is terrible what's happening around the world. Let's just try and figure it out and come to a mutual understanding. I'm hearing a lot of that, which is really encouraging. And I hope that that's what happens with poker as well. Yep. I hope the calmer and the smarter people in the industry protect the industry and say, this is what we need to do to get past. And yeah, it's not everything, but we'll get back to everything one day. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater in the meantime. And let's hopefully not see the greed bubble to the surface. That's what that's an instant red flag for me. As soon as you see that kind of, it's almost, in my view, at this time, it's almost in line with war profiteering. People out there almost sinisterly looking for opportunities to cut a corner while the rest of the world is suffering. I much prefer let's get to a table and figure it out together, and then we move forward, and then later on we can look at each other and we're good. But
sure.
if you know what I mean, ethics in business is very
Totally
important.
Agree.
I agree.
Totally
with you.
agree.
There needs to be a standard. I know poker is gambling and gaming, but there still needs to be a really high standard.
At the end of the day, we are in the midst of once in a 100-year event. And what I'm certainly seeing on a personal level and also on a professional level is that people they are taking stock. The world is not going to come to an end. It's just all on hold. It's on pause. So then by the time this all finishes, everything's going to pick back up. The live scene, as soon as we start, you'll see numbers at events like you've never seen.
And a lot of hand sanitizer to go with it.
Absolutely.
Just promise me one thing. Just promise me, Lando, you won't wear that shirt. I'm not a trendsetter. I'm not a snob. I love the background, but that shirt.
So, let's wrap it up there. There'll still be plenty more to come in future PMA podcasts. We're going to have some of the game's best and brightest on. We've got a whole bunch of exciting things planned. And of course, you'll get to see our lovely faces, not only on the vlog version, but you can also download the straight audio onto wherever good podcasts are supplied. So from all of us here at PokerMedia Australia, Ben Blaschke, Khoury, I'm Landon Blackhall. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.